So it's in conservation yet again, in conservation with. My name is David Lindo, also known as the Urban Birder. And by the way, if you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe and tell all your friends because there's so much to be seen and heard and learnt from this series of conversations with some of the movers and shakers within the world of conservation. Tonight, this afternoon, this morning, depending on what time and where you are, I'm speaking with Merilyn Simonds, who is a celebrated writer, Canadian writer. And Marilyn and I go back a little way because I think I met her initially online during lockdown
Yeah.
via a mutual friend, Margaret Atwood. But before we even get into that, let me welcome you to In Conservation with Marilyn. How are you and where are you?
Oh, thank you so much, David. It's so lovely to see your face again. We've seen each other's faces in many different circumstances. I am in Mexico. Can you see the bird on my shirt? There, birds. Um, I live here half the year, from more or less November or late October to April. Because I normally live in Canada, and that's a really lousy time to be in Canada. And it's so wonderful here. So we're up in the mountains. If you put your finger right in the middle of the funnel that's Mexico, that's where I am, in the geographic center of the country, up in the Sierra Madre mountains near Sierra Gorda. And it's just a great place. It's the wintering grounds of a lot of the birds that we see in Canada during the summer. So it's kind of lovely to see them in both places.
From your accent there, it sounds like you can utter Spanish. Is that?
I can. I can utter Spanish, even speak it.
But you spent your formative years in Brazil, didn't you?
That's right. Yeah, I grew as a young child. So born in Winnipeg, spent up to the end of grade one in Ontario, and then the family moved to Brazil, where I was until I was 13. So I was fluent in Portuguese at that time, but of course it entirely dropped away. But I think it has been really important to me in learning Spanish because you get that. My ear was accustomed to Romance languages, when I was still using my lizard brain. So uh, the accent is still there, even if the vocabulary isn't always.
How long did it take you to learn Spanish? I'm in southwest Spain. I've been based in Spain for 8 years. Not that I've been here every day. I mean, I'm all over
Yeah.
the show really, but I've found it really difficult. Although, to be honest, I had a problem a couple of days ago when my internet wasn't working at all, and I had to go and deal with it. Not speaking a word of English, I had to go and sort of talk in Spanish and explain what my problem was, and I managed to do it in quite
Yay.
easily. And next day I had a new box and plugged it in, and away I went again. So
Yeah.
maybe I know more than I think I do, but
You probably do, but the thing is, you're talking about Spain Spanish, and I have just for the folks at home, I'm coming to the Extremadura in April, and I'm very excited to go bird watching with David. But Spain Spanish is so different from Mexican Spanish, so we'll see how well I do with that, just in the pronunciation and the speed. Um, I understand that you know Hispanics from Spain speak at an enormously fast rate compared to Mexico.
yeah, I
But we'll
mean,
see.
I've noticed that too. I mean, in South America and Central America, it's kind of slower, and in some places like Colombia, kind of sweeter sounding. Whereas here,
Mm,
in Extremadura, for example, and Andalusia, the language is clipped fast. They use
mm.
words that you don't even realize. You think what the hell's that? And there's lots of um, sayings and you know
Yeah, idioms. Yeah.
yeah, idioms in there. It becomes very confusing, and you kind of think
Well,
I'll never ever be a local ever. Even if I lived there 1,000 years.
So learning the bird calls and learning, catching an ear for the Extremadura Spanish, that'll be a double challenge.
So over your life, I mean, you wrote your first book when you were 29.
Yeah.
You've written what, 20 books now?
Yeah, I published 20.
Yeah,
Yeah. So that's, one every however many years that is, I don't know. Yeah, one every 2 or 3 years. Yeah.
and you've written non fiction as well. You've written novels. Um, I'm always in awe of writers, even though I'm supposedly one myself. I'm so fascinated by processes, and you've written this amazing book, which is
Oh,
called
you have a
Worth Watching.
copy. Yay.
Yeah, I
I
got a
have a
copy.
copy too. Yay.
Um, and it's, I mean, I love the title anyway, and the book's about what we're going to be talking about today. An amazing woman called Louise, the Carolyn Lawrence, and her life in Canada and her influence on the world of ornithology to this day. Um, it's, I guess, you've acted as a biographer of her life, and I just wondered how do you do that? How do you write about someone? Do you actually get into a situation where you become that person that you actually are researching?
No, 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 not me. I mean, there are people who say that, but that's not my process. I don't read biographies. I don't like the way most biographies are written, that kind of know-it-all stance. Um, and unwrapping the life from sort of birth to death. That sort of thing doesn't interest me. So she asked me to be her biographer, oh my goodness, maybe 35 years ago, not too long before she died. And she died 30 years ago the past spring. And I really had no idea how I was going to do that, because I didn't like all the standard ways of approaching a biography. So I think really the truth of it is I had to get, another dozen books under my belt before I had the confidence to tackle her. And I knew her, right? And I respected her enormously. And she was such a unique individual. I wanted readers to get to know her the same way that I did, which was, through her stories and through her own words. And luckily, I had reams and reams and reams of letters she wrote to her mother, good daughter that she was. She wrote to her mother every Sunday for 40 years. And the letters were typewritten, 5, 6, 7 single space typewritten pages. And she told her mother everything, her bird watching, what birds she was watching, what nests she was watching, who was visiting, her ambitions as a writer, her lack of confidence in the English language. I mean, she talked about just about everything, even how long it took her to gather the sugar on her wartime sugar rations to make a lemon pie. And so tons and tons of detail. So the book is heavily laced, as you know, having read it, with quotes from her letters, not only to her mother, but she wrote, I mean, I don't know what biographers today are going to do in the internet age, but she wrote to all the major ornithologists around the world. If she wanted to know something and she thought somebody in Costa Rica, like Alexander Skutch, had the answer, that's where she wrote. And she had huge correspondences with these people. And then the other thing is she wrote almost 100 scientific and popular articles. So I also used that. So I had her voice is really present. And then the other thing I decided to do was I wanted to show, what I call bare the bones of the biography. So I take the reader, into the Royal Ontario Museum when I was sitting in the bird vaults looking at Louisa's skins that she sent, 50 years before to the museum, and you're surrounded by these huge cabinets with 140,000 dead birds in them. And so, I take the reader there. I take them into archives where all her letters were And I shared with the reader I was pretty uncomfortable at some points when I knew very personal things about her past, about her relationships. And should I air those? Should I share those with the reader? And so I think any biography, you bump into this huge ethical problem. You're telling a person's life and they're dead. They can't tell you, oh, don't tell that and do tell that. So I share those dilemmas with the reader too. And then there's also a little thread of me through there because I knew her. And I've been watching birds since I was 7. So, every so often my own birds and my own sort of life around birds and around her in Northern Ontario, that all creeps in too. So it's kind of an unconventional hybrid biography memoir, kind of.
Well, I think maybe now's the point, because there's a little film that you shared with me, which I like to share with everyone else. Can you just quickly tell us the history of this film? Because it was
Right.
shot by your son?
Yeah, it was produced and directed by my granddaughter,
Granddaughter.
and it all started. The idea for it started the same places where I said I wanted the readers to get to know Louise. And one of the things that I thought was so remarkable about Louise was her voice. I mean, she's Swedish, she's upper class, she has this great accent, but she also has this way of speaking where, unlike me, who kind of blurts, she was very considered in the way she spoke. If she said something, you knew it was what she believed. So I had these interview tapes. I did a magazine article on her in 1989. So I had these horrible little, the micro cassettes,
Yeah.
just terrible quality little tapes. And my son is a sound engineer for film and movies. And so I said, can you clean these up? And he said, not easily, but I think I can do it. So he cleaned up the tapes. And of course, that then led me to, well, why don't we make a film about her? And so my granddaughter had just graduated from film school. She'd made a few films. So I put my granddaughter together with her uncle, the sound designer. And as luck would have it, the people who own Louise's house now, their son is a videographer. So we hired him to do footage. And we got a lot of archival stuff. And my granddaughter wrote the script, put it together, I narrate, and my son cleaned up the tapes. So now there you have it, 11 minutes.
It's great to keep it in the family, as it were. Okay, I'm gonna attempt to share this with everyone, and oops, I'm hoping that I can share the sound as well. Can you see the screen?
We can.
Can you see the video?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's see if we can play this.
Every morning for 50 years, Louise de Caroline Lawrence walked the paths through her forest on the Mattawa River, watching the songbirds that arrived from their winter homes in Central and South America to breed in Northern Ontario. Louise was born in 1894, goddaughter of the Queen of Denmark and a debutante at the Swedish court. She was close to her father, a devoted conservationist, and she expected to inherit the family estate on the Baltic Sea. But when her father died suddenly, the land was sold for debts, and Louise was forced to move with her mother and her sister to a small apartment in Stockholm. Headstrong and principled, Louise trained as a Red Cross nurse as soon as the First World War erupted. She was posted to a Russian prisoner of war camp, where she fell in love with a white Russian officer, Gleb Nikolaevich. They married, and she followed him to Archangel, high in the Russian Arctic. When the White Russians were defeated by the Bolsheviks, Louise and Gleb joined 1,000 sleigh loads of refugees in a futile dash to Finland. They were captured and sent to a Moscow prison where Gleb vanished.
I simply couldn't believe that I wouldn't see him again. So I stayed on in Russia for 3 more years after, always hoping that I would be able to find out what had happened.
Louise and Gleb had dreamed of emigrating to Canada, a country much like Sweden and Russia. In 1926, she emigrated alone, landing in the village of Bondfield, east of North Bay, Ontario, where she set up a Red Cross outpost hospital, traveling to the sick by dog sled in winter and Model T Ford in summer. Among her patients were the Dionnes, who became famous as parents of the first quintuplets in the world to survive more than a day. As nurse in charge, Louise brought the babies through their first year, but the media circus around the quints was overwhelming. She bought a piece of forest on Pimsey Bay, had a log cabin built, and retreated into her wilderness. Today, the Trans-Canada Highway roars past Louise's forest, but when she bought the property, that road was just a survey line through the trees. She hired a local man, Len Lawrence, to finish the inside of the cabin and build her furniture. He stayed on, building a cabin of his own deeper in the woods, the foundation stones still visible today. Together, they started a poultry business with the hope that chickens and eggs would pay the bills, while Louise wrote a book about her year with the Quints. Len and Louise grew close, and on September the 11th, 1939, the day after the Second World War was declared, they eloped. And Louise waved her second husband off to war.
When Len was overseas, my days were occupied from the early morning until late at night. And all was governed by my study of birds.
Slowly, with the help of books, Louise learned to tell a hairy woodpecker from a pileated, a white-crowned from a white-throated sparrow. She corresponded with expert bird scientists across North America and Europe, especially women like herself who were juggling domesticity and science. Women who helped change ornithology from a science that killed its subjects in order to analyze them, to an observational study of how birds behaved. Every morning before dawn, Louise would slip her binoculars over her neck, tuck her bird count journal in one pocket, her bird guides in another, and grab her basket of mirrors so she could peer deep into the branches for nests. On rainy days, she'd pin a cushion to the hem of her coat, flipping it under her to sit on soggy stumps as she watched. She carried a sketchbook too, teaching herself to draw as a way of seeing more deeply into the lives of birds. Between 1942 and 1959, Louise operated the most northerly bird banding station in Ontario, slipping tiny aluminum bands around the ankles of 2,628 birds, representing 50 species. She kept meticulous records of each one, the basis for her studies.
I remember especially I studied the nest of a great jay, and I would go there and sit there for the whole day. And it was a cold time because it snowed. I used to take lunch with me and blankets with me and sit there around that nest and take down notes on every move that those birds made. And I sat there for about 5 days and wrote it up in an ornithological journal. That was my first study.
Louise was the first to document the reproductive cycle of the Canada jay, now Canada's national bird. The first to record the life history of the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And she was the first to follow a red-eyed vireo and count the number of songs it sang in one day. An amazing 22,197, a dawn to dusk birdsong count record that has never yet been broken. Over the next 40 years, Louise wrote more than 100 popular and scientific articles on birds and a shelf of influential books.
The quintuplets first year was one. The log house nest was the next. Then it was this monograph on the woodpeckers, on 4 species of woodpeckers, and The Lovely and the Wild.
The Lovely and the Wild, an intimate memoir of her life with birds, was awarded the 1969 John Burroughs Medal for the most distinguished book of natural history that year, the first Canadian woman to win this international prize. At the age of 83, she released the poignant story of her Russian odyssey, Another Winter, Another Spring. And at 86, her final book, To Whom the Wilderness Speaks. Louise died in the spring of 1992 at 98, but visitors still walk the winding path from the road to her loghouse nest, bathed in the sights and sounds and smells of nature. The ladder she climbed to smear peanut butter on a tree trunk for the red-breasted nuthatches still leans against the white pine, now grown tall. And Phoebe's still nest outside her bedroom window, positioned so she could wake every morning with the sun in her face. Stoked with endless curiosity, Louise struggled to understand the birds around her. Through the late 1940s and early 1950s, she tracked the sharp decline in warblers and flycatchers and linked it to the roadside spraying of toxic chemicals, a decade before Rachel Carson's Silent Spring sounded the same alarm. Some call Louise de Caroline Lawrence a Canadian Rachel Carson or a Canadian Thoreau. But unlike those iconic American nature writers, Louise was tucked in her northern Ontario woods, where she was hardly known outside a circle of local friends and international bird scientists. But that didn't matter to Louise.
Life is not just the moment when you live, which is a very short moment in the continuation of time. I can't see it just at the moment. I have to see the whole thing. I have to see the universe.
She would be pleased that scientists are finally proving experimentally the behaviors she observed, that the hoarding of chickadees is intentional and that birdsong is language. And she would rejoice in the rise of citizen science, in the contribution amateur birders can make through apps like eBird. Most of all, she would welcome the shift in ornithological science that now looks at the world of birds as she did, from the bird's perspective, breaking down human assumptions of superiority, seeing birds and humans as two species sharing the natural world in harmonious association. The loghouse nest where Louise de Caroline Lawrence studied birds for half a century still stands on the shore of Pimsey Bay, a testament to the self-trained amateur naturalist and writer who, through curiosity, devotion, and a stubbornly individual life, changed how we see the birds around us.
It has been a living that has been very profound and very thorough and very warm and very natural.
That was a very lovely film. I think that really it's quite moving, actually. And
Yeah, well, yeah, I haven't watched it for a while. I tear up every time I watch it.
I feel personally, I feel embarrassed. But prior to your book, I'd never heard of this woman. Yet
Yeah,
she
well, you
is,
and everybody else.
yeah, she is clearly was a phenomenal woman. Um, and we talk about what some of the stuff she's actually kind of left as a legacy, but it kind of made me also think about, and I always think about this subject because I've talked about it several times in the history of in conservation with over the last 3 years now, the role of women within the world of natural sciences or within science generally, and you can even go further and say within life generally, and how overlooked and disregarded they have been and in some instances continue to be. I'm astounded really because everyone can contribute to the whole picture, yet
Mhm.
certain elements of our, our population, whatever, are kind of sidelined because men predominantly are taking the limelight, you know.
Well, in the book, I dedicate a whole chapter to the kind of the legacy of women amateur ornithologists that Louise stepped into. And I was astonished when I researched that part, because I mean the first bird guide in North America was written by a woman. There's just like one is the whole hat trade, right? That was killing 5 million birds a year at the turn of the last century. That whole campaign to stop the bird feathers in hat trade was started and run by women. And Louise wasn't the only kind of eccentric lady out there tromping the woods and watching birds. There were dozens and dozens of them. And I think that really the natural scientists, the natural sciences did allow women in kind of this sideways way, because they were the ones who, well, let's face it, were pretty patient, who had the patience and the time and often the opportunity to go tramping in the woods for days and days. I mean, the stuff Louise did, like sitting in a snowbank for 5 days watching a Canada jay nest, absolutely nothing at the time. Not one thing was known about the reproductive cycle of the Canada jay. Somebody just said, like a bird watching Jane Goodall. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And there's another woman in Ontario, and I don't remember her name, I'm ashamed to say, but she studied giraffes, and she was the same. So there are these women who have this passionate affection for some particular thing, and they're able to pursue it. Now, what's different is they're often not able to get published. They're not able, nobody remembers them. They don't rise. Rachel Carson, we know, because she was kind of a natural speaker. She got up there on the hustings, and she promoted her idea of the connection between pesticides and herbicides and songbird decline. But often these women who did the work didn't have the opportunity to share their voice. And I think that's changing. I don't know if you've had Jennifer Ackerman on the show?
She opened our fifth series of In Conservation with last month, I think, or October. Yeah,
Oh, she's so fantastic.
she
She's
is.
just I love all her books. And when I talked to her about this, she said that it's really turning around again. There are so many women in ornithology now, as ornithology moves from, so it started out as a field science, observationally based. And then in the 70s and 80s and 90s, it became very sort of experimental, lab-based. And now in the last 20 years, it's moving out of that into a more combined laboratory plus field studies, because really, it's hard to understand the behavior of birds unless you can see them in the wild. And the advantage now is that you can plant cameras, you can plant audio equipment, you can be far in a distance. In Louise's day, she had to be sitting right there, and she had to, cover herself with branches and all kinds of disguises so that she could blend in with the environment. And it took her much longer because she had to wait days and days and days for the birds to get comfortable with her being there. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I've veered way off your question.
No, that's what conversations are, aren't they? We just choose
a walk in the woods.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you talked about, I guess, the birth of the Audubon Society, which was, created by women, and the same thing occurred in the UK a little bit earlier with the Royal Society for Protection of Birds. I mean, that was the Society for Protection of Birds, and it was formed by 6 women from the Manchester area, predominantly in northern England, and basically, they fought to stop the millinery trade from operating and causing extinction of several species. And I was horrified, when I visited the lodge, the headquarters of the RSPB a few years ago, and you walk through the building. It's quite an impressive building, but on the walls are paintings of men. And I'm like, where are the women? Where are those women that formed this whole thing? And apparently it wasn't until, I think, 2 years ago, and it wasn't until people were harassing the organization, and it wasn't until those very same people had to raise money to make us, to build a statue in honor of one of the main women. I mean, yeah. I just don't get it. And do you think that Louise, did she kind of shun the limelight? Did she think to herself, I should be out there, but campaigning not only for birds but also for women to be recognized? Did she kind of think that in those terms?
Well, for one thing, Louise had her fill of being in the media limelight when those quintuplets were born. And I mean, it's worth looking back at that era a little bit. I mean, 3,000 people a day came to walk past the playground of those children, right? I mean, it was nuts. There were journalists from all over the world that camped in Northern Ontario for years, and all they did was feed stories back to their various countries. And Louise was she was such a good storyteller even then, and she was she was an international person, and so she could speak 5 languages, so she was kind of a natural interviewee. So yeah, she moved into the woods to get away from that. But I don't think she felt really comfortable promoting herself. Talking about the quints was one thing, but I don't think she would have promoted herself. You can only do a certain number of things in a life, right? You kind of have to choose. And what she wanted to do was study the birds. She wanted to answer every question that came to her about how birds live. And you can't do it all, you can't be out and about talking. And she did a fair amount of that when her books came out. But her publishers would not send her on tour. It was not only sexism, it was ageism. She was, I don't know, maybe 60s or so, 70s. And her publisher said, when she said she wanted to go on a book tour, she said, well, do you really think, dear, that you're able to do that? And this is a woman who could tramp after a red-eyed vireo for 14 hours, right? And count 22,197 songs. I mean, they didn't know who they were dealing with. So yeah, I think she was definitely a feminist, but I'm not sure she would have called herself that because there wasn't the language around that at the time. But basically her she did her work, and her husband devoted himself to helping her in her work. You know, it was quite an unusual relationship for the time.
You know, it's difficult though, because it does come down to how you are as a person, and it's hard um, to to think of yourself promoting yourself. You know,
Yes.
I speak to many people who have that same dilemma. They got an important thing to say, but they feel very exposed. I mean, for example, in my career, when I first started, I felt a little bit awkward talking, you know, trying to promote myself in order to promote my message. But then the way I got over that, I suppose, without even realizing, was to create a persona, the urban birder.
Exactly.
So that's on stage, not me.
Yeah.
You can attack that. You want to hurt me, kind of thing. But not everyone, I suppose, invents those kind of barriers or shields. Um,
Or
so
wants to take up that kind of energy, right? I mean, it takes a certain amount of energy to do that, and kind of a split in your life. And I think, you know, I think of myself, this book has been out for almost 2 years. And, you know, I mean, I've done, I don't know, 70, 80 talks around the book in the last year. And I have the book. It doesn't have to be me. It's about Louise. And so that's really terrific. But I think for Louise, her life in the bush was so different from the life out there in the world, that whenever she did it, I mean, she didn't even really go to birding conferences very much. And it was because the social interaction exhausted her, just because of, you know, all the people, all the ideas, all the things to read, all the things to say, putting yourself out there. And she was worried about being attacked for her theories, because her theories were really, they were not au courant, you know. I mean, she believed birdsong was language. Well, we didn't start believing birdsong was language for, you know, until maybe 20 years ago. So yeah, it was a different world. But I think there must still be people like her in the woods doing this kind of work, and not being known for it.
yeah, it's interesting because, you know, the older I get, the more I realize that sometimes when you have a vocation in life, you just do it. You have to do it.
Yeah.
And maybe promoting it or promoting yourself doesn't even come into it. It's funny because before talking to you today, I just happened to be scrolling through Facebook idly, and I came across a bit of footage featuring Duke Ellington, and someone was saying to him, you know, you're an amazing musician. You know, how do you do it? And he said, I don't know. This is dreaming. It's dreaming. And he just started playing this amazing sort of made up tune, and he just said, "This is dreaming." And it kind of resonated with me because it kind of reminded me of Louise, or reminded me of a lot of people who dedicate their lives to something, and it's not done for fame, it's not done for money, it's something that you just have to do. Do you think that did she actually realize what impact she was having on the world?
No, I don't think so at all. She was really happy that she was earning the respect of other ornithologists. And I do have to say that I was reading really closely for, you know, nuances of, or blatant sexism, and it just wasn't there. You know, her mentors, the people who helped her learn about ornithology, the people who took her under their wing as professional scientists, and made sure that she knew how to collect the data in a responsible and respectable way, so that her studies would be taken seriously. It didn't matter how elementary her question, they answered it, and they brought her work forward in just an amazing egalitarian way. I was very, very surprised, because this was the 40s and the 50s, right? It was a time when certainly most women in Canada, were not allowed to join naturalist and ornithological clubs,
It's amazing.
which is kind of shocking. Yeah.
So
They
she,
had to form their own. Like she and her best friend Doris Spears, who was studying the evening grosbeak, they formed the first Canadian women's naturalist club. Yeah.
okay. Is Doris still with us?
No, no.
Okay. So Louise just decided to go off into the woods. That's a big thing, isn't it?
Yeah, especially the Northern Ontario woods. What she didn't know, and that I didn't know until I started talking to a bird scientist who Bob Montgomery, he became the reader for my book. But he told me that the place where she built her cabin is a really special birding place. And she didn't even know this. She didn't know birds at the time. But it's the northernmost limit of southern breeding birds in Ontario and the southernmost limit of northern breeding birds. So they overlap at that point on the Mattawa River. And so she had twice the sort of bird population to study and to interact with. It was really quite accidental.
Does she have a favorite sort of family of birds to study, or a particular species that she really loved?
She certainly had particular affection for certain birds. So the first bird she really saw was a Baltimore oriole. She called it a jelly belly because she didn't know what it was, but it was orange, and so she thought it looked like it had nested in a bowl of marmalade. So she called it Jelly Belly, and that was the one that drove her to learn what its actual name was, the Baltimore oriole, etc. So she always had an affection for the orioles, and it was quite rare in Northern Ontario at that time. And then the first bird the winter that she was alone after Len went off to war, that she really noticed was a northern cardinal, and it wasn't the northern record for that bird at that time. It had been seen, a few miles further north before, recorded, but she always liked the cardinal, which is why I thought it was sort of interesting that the designer put a cardinal on the cover of the book, because designers don't usually read the book, so I'm not sure he read the book and knew that. And she also, she loved the red-eyed vireo. She loved the vireo family, and she loved the warblers, for the songs. But she was also really, she had merlins there, and she did a major study on merlins. And in fact, so she found a merlin family and a nest. And her first interest for studying that nest was that she saw that there were small songbirds nesting underneath the nest. And she thought, how weird is that? Because, the merlin is a major predator of small songbirds. So one day when the parents were gone, she climbed up 40 feet up a white pine. and there was sort of a midden of burns and bird bones and bird poop in there. And so she scooped it all out, and she took it down, and she sent it away to an ornithologist friend of hers, who analyzed it and told her exactly what birds that merlin was eating, and it wasn't warblers. And then when that couple of merlins had young, when the young were only maybe even only just a week old, I don't remember exactly, the parents disappeared, who knows where. And so she noticed, she was still watching the nest. She noticed the parents didn't come back. So she went up and she got the birds, the baby birds, and she raised them. She wasn't the sort of person who liked to do that. She didn't really believe in it as a sort of a scientific approach. But, she couldn't see the birds die up there. So she raised them until they could fly. And then once they could fly, they actually went back to their home tree, which was really sort of interesting. So she had had these birds that she had a real personal relationship with, I guess. And so, she's those are the birds that she tended to talk about, and the chickadees, because I don't think she ever wrote this up as a study, but when I was visiting her one day, she was talking about the fact that she'd been watching them and recording the fact that the chickadees. So she had a bunch of different band of chickadees. So she knew which chickadee was hiding seed where, like under the bark of a tree, or in a crevice, or in a fence post, etc. And then in the winter, she noticed that they went back and they retrieved the food they had stored in the same order that they stored it. And so she believed that hoarding was intentional. Whereas before that, everybody just thought, well, they just they're just putting it away, and then they accidentally stumble upon, oh, here's dinner, right? But no, she figured out that it was intentional. And in fact, I think it was fairly recently when that data started to be to come out, and now they know that it is intentional. So when she talked to me, she was always talking to me about the birds that she had these, very personal relationships with.
Yes, it's really fascinating her discovering, the fact that smaller birds were nesting near the Merlin, something that we take for granted nowadays, because we know that occurs.
That cone of safety, right?
Yeah, and it's just it's amazing that she actually sussed that out so long ago.
Well, she was an observer, right?
Yeah.
And she was a nurse, and she raised those babies, and she was used to observing, and not only just looking, but trying to figure out what she was seeing meant. And so, I think it was part of it was part of her personality, but also part of a long training. This observational capacity that she had. It was amazing, really.
Do you think, had her first husband, survived and had been with her, would she have carried on down his path?
Isn't that an interesting question, David? No one has asked me that. And it's such an interesting question. I don't know. So they were going to emigrate to Canada anyway. That was their plan, because he was Russian, she was Swedish. The Russian and the Swedes have had a mad on for centuries, right? Like, he didn't feel comfortable in Sweden, she didn't feel comfortable in Russia. Neither of them felt comfortable with the Bolshevik Revolution. And so they had decided to emigrate to Canada. So, it might have. He was also, as a wealthy Russian, had been raised on a country estate and had an affection for the natural environment, the same as her. I mean, her father was a really well-known naturalist. He went to university at the University of Uppsala, where Darwin was, and not Darwin. What am I talking about? Sorry, Linnaeus. Where Linnaeus was, and he was there at university the year that Origin of Species came out. He was very influenced by that late 19th century naturalist tradition, and he and his friends actually set up the world's second conservation area. The first is Yellowstone, but there's one on Karlsö Island in the Baltic Sea, just off the coast of Sweden, that he and his friends set up. They bought up all the land on the island because the auks were disappearing because of egg hunting and bird hunting. And so they bought it and turned it into a conservation area. And all the major conservationists, naturalist painters like Bruno Lillefor, they all ended up at Louise's house. And so the talk around the dinner table was of birds and conservation. Even in those, at that, she was born in 1894, so we're talking the very last years of the 19th century.
Wow. You wrote Woman Watching, as far as I know, during the pandemic, yeah?
I did.
But it obviously took a lot longer than that, didn't it? The process.
Well, who knows how long a book takes to write, right? I mean, she asked me to be her biographer 35 years before it was published. So, it's on your mind. A book is on your mind for years before some sort of magic alchemy happens, before you think, oh, that's what I want to work on now. I can see my way into this book now in some way. So yeah, it was sort of bad luck that I decided the year before the pandemic that that's the next book I would work on. She has 26 boxes of material at Archives Canada. And so I went there, I went through all 26 in a week, and I made notes on which ones I intended to go back and look at in depth. Well, within months, all the archives had closed, and that was that. I always have to give a huge shout out to archivists because at first they couldn't even go into work, but then when they were able to go into work, and when the boxes were allowed to be opened, et cetera, for, without fearing contagion, they went in and they digitized everything for me. It was just amazing. So I now have 26 boxes of Louise's archives in my house.
That's amazing. I met you, I met you online maybe 2 years ago, I think.
2 years ago?
No, maybe
2
longer.
or 3. I think
3
it might
years
have
ago,
been 3. Yeah.
Yeah, because I was, you were one of the organizers of the Peely Island Bird Observatory Festival, and it was online.
Yes, that year it was, my goodness.
Yeah, that's how we first met. And then I actually met you physically last year on Peely Island itself, which is the most southerly point of Canada. For those of you,
it is.
I didn't know myself.
And a fantastic birding place because it's for anybody listening doesn't know, it's at the very western crook of Lake Erie, equidistant from Ontario and Ohio, and it's a pinch point. So there are the two major North American flyways, the Eastern Flyway and the Mississippi Flyway, both go through there. And so there are tens of millions of birds go over Peely Island twice a year for the spring and fall migrations. And there's a bird observatory there that has been running for 20 years. And I'm now chair of the board of directors somehow. And we're in the process of building a new bird center on the island. So you have to come back when we open the bird center, probably the summer of 2025.
Excellent. I mean, I had the pleasure of birding with yourself and your husband, Wayne, last year, which was great. Unfortunately, our time there did end a bit weirdly because COVID was stalking amongst us.
One of our gang got COVID, and then you got COVID.
Yeah, it was a bit of a strange story that, because I actually left the island not realizing I had it until I hit mainland, and I was in Richmond opposite Detroit, and I decided I better give myself a test, and I realized, oh my God, I got COVID.
Yeah.
So that was a bit.
Well, I'm still a COVID virgin, so who knows if I will manage to escape this particular pandemic. It won't be the last, I'm sure.
Yeah, I'm sure. In terms of you, I mean, what are you working on next? Can you say?
Oh yeah, I'm far enough along that I can say. So as you mentioned at the beginning, I write both fiction and nonfiction, and I generally I guess I write about whatever I feel like writing about, and I write in the form and in the genre that makes the most sense for that material. So I'm always moving all over the map, and I like experimental formats best because that's most interesting to me. So I have a novel finished that takes place here in Mexico during the Zapatista War. That's out under consideration. And the one I'm actually writing now is, it's called Still Life with Beth. And it's a series of conversations with one of my closest friends, who's 103 years old, and I'm 73 years old. So exactly 30 years apart. And our conversations just go all over the place. So all through COVID, we would take a walk every day, or every week, or have a phone call from Mexico every week. And this book is just a mosaic of conversations that I think, it's in progress, so this could change. But at the moment, the thread for me is, what does the next 30 years look like? I mean, we're used to having only our 70, right? Well, now, right now in Ontario, 4,000 people are over 100 years of age, and 1,400 of those live alone in their own homes and are completely independent. And my friend Beth is one of those. When I was sick last year, she drove over and picked me up and took me out to the river, for tea, for a picnic by the river. I mean, she drives, she completely looks after herself. She's 103. So I find that curious, how does she stay such a contemporary citizen of the world after 103 years on the planet, without complaint, totally engaged in art, in science, in human relationships. How does that happen when so many people, as they age, kind of drop away and become sour and introspective and encased in their own complaints? So that's what that book is about, maybe. We'll see.
Well, that sounds very interesting, and I'm sure it'll be an amazing read when you do it. I guess I've got a couple more questions to ask. Obviously, you're a birder.
Yeah.
What species do you love the most?
Oh, goodness. Really? I have to choose?
Oh, yeah. I have one
Well,
now.
okay, I'll tell you the one that I'm always looking for here, is there are two that are seen rarely here, but I'm always on the lookout for them. And one is the phenopepla, and the other is the pyrrhuloxia. And I know the pyrrhuloxia is in the cardinal family, right? I don't know
It's
about
very
the
similar
phenopepla.
to.
It also has a nice.
Yeah, it's very similar. It's
It
close
looks
related.
similar, right? Because
Yes.
it has a nice big crest.
It's close related to Northern Cardinal. Yeah.
Yeah. So they both might be in the cardinal family. I'm not sure. But 3 days ago, so we live in San Miguel de Allende, and San Miguel is in the bowl of a volcano. So all the sides kind of go up. And so we live part way up the hill. So from our rooftop, we have a beautiful, huge view of the city. And a couple of nights ago, we were sitting up there and we saw 150 white pelicans fly over. It was just amazing. It was
Beautiful.
amazing. Yeah. So I guess I'm a bit of a bird slut. I don't really have a favorite. I like whatever amazing bird I'm seeing at the moment. They're all amazing.
Did you say bird slut?
I did.
Wow, I've never heard that one before. Might have to use that. And final question: if you could be anywhere in the world, I guess I know the answer to this question, but if you could be anywhere in the world right now, where would you be?
I can't imagine a better place than where I am. It's The weather's always 25 degrees during the day. It's always sunny. It's filled with color. The people are the most compassionate people I've ever been around. Loving, thoughtful, kind. The food is fantastic. We have very, very good friends here from all over the world because it's sort of an arts mecca. There's all these people have moved here, and so the music, the opera, the dance, the literature, it's all at a much higher level than one would expect. So yeah, I really love it here.
Well, don't blame you. Just to let everyone know, there's a few more interesting in conservation with interviews, conversations, probably a better word, coming up, discussing subjects ranging from cryptozoology to what does the Royal Society of Protection of Birds mean, to talking about the UK's wild bird superhighway, which is a new thing, even though it's been there for millions of years. I mean, we just basically just realised it's there now. All those things coming up. So please keep tuned in to In Conservation With. Tell all your friends, like and subscribe, and become a member of the Urban Bird World community. And you can watch what's going to come next, which is a Q&A. But Merilyn, great to see you. Thank you for sparing your time. Looking forward to seeing you next year in Extremadura in Spain. And
Yes.
I wish you all the best as well.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed
listen,
this tremendously.
The moment I met you, I thought you need to be a guest on this. So thank you for for accepting. And Zoomers, thank you very much as well. Until we meet again, don't forget to keep looking up.